back to talk about his book. I'm going to hold it up this time. It's What's Left of the World. It's the book of the month for the Zero Books Club here on our Patreon. And we're going to talk about.
Does that make us kind of a book of the month club?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay.
It's Book of the Month Club.
Okay.
People signed up, and then because they never told me they wanted it to stop, it just keeps coming.
That's right.
And they don't get to pick what they get.
Right.
All right. So
books for $1.
Yeah, right.
Remember,
and then after that, it's $100 a book.
Yeah.
So the all right. So to start this off, the section I want to talk to you about this time is called higher nihilism. I guess that's instead of higher education.
Right. Yes.
Right. And in that section, you accuse kind of the American university system of being nihilist at base. And
and I think
so I just want to hear like I guess the first thing to note about that, the reason you say that or the first bit of evidence you give is you talk about how in higher education now, there's a lot of emphasis on having a positive effect or impact on the community that the university is in, or even the country that the university is in. It could be conceived of on that level as a kind of general project of all the universities, but you're skeptical about this idea that the university system should be aimed at calculating its impact, or even that there is such a thing as a well-defined impact for education. And the thing I noted was that the aim of education is to reduce, comes down to like reducing crime. If you have an educated population, then you're going to have less crime. Is that the idea?
You mean on the part of?
Well, you mentioned that, don't you?
Overseeing the system. Yeah. I mean, I think there's an analogy with crime statistics, where I think in that particular passage, as I recall, I was making a comparison with crime statistics and with how one might the relationship between crime statistics and policing and the justice system are often taken to be self-evident where they're not. I'm glad you mentioned the point with having to do with impact, though, because I guess maybe that's a way into the discussion that we could pursue. And I do mention this as well. I found, in British universities, they're even kind of worse in a way and more developed along these lines. But certainly here, this notion of impact is quite a buzzword, and it comes in various guises. But the idea is that there should be measurables. There should be measurable consequences to one's research in particular, and that's teaching. As a university professor, you're doing teaching, you're doing service of various kinds, committee work, learning organizations, sometimes things in one's community and so on. So there's a service category, but there's also the research category. And the notion of impact pervades all three of those, but really it's the research area that's the one that they're focusing on. And one thing I noticed is this language of impact is pretty ubiquitous, but it's also very narrow. And what I mean by that is, and I mentioned this in the book, I remember raising this once as just actually a pretty innocent question. So, there's all this talk about impact, and we're supposed to document the impact of our work. So, for example, back a few years ago when the last book came out, I did a bunch of podcasts and things, and they actually loved that I could actually tell them the number of views of or listens or downloads of podcast interviews or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And say magazine pieces where you could actually, because they love numbers, they want it quantified. So they want measurables that are quantified, but there's all this discussion of impact. And so for others in other fields, obviously, if you're in, say, medical research, it's going to be a much clearer and more compelling case that you can make about, well, I found a cure for this, or some new drug that works in this way, or we better way to build a bridge, or something like that. It's a much easier game for those in technological fields to play. But the strange thing is that the impact is never there are no norms given to it. There's no value attached to it. And what I mean by that is there's no requirement that one shows a beneficial impact. It could be, and I raised the question, well, what if I did really impactful research and it turned out to be deleterious, harmful to humanity as a whole, but I have lots of impact, and there's typically no way in those standards to untangle whether or not the impact one has had. And we're just talking about university researchers now in terms of one's research and so on. There's no way to untangle whether that impact has been beneficial or harmful or what, because if you think about it, that would involve a discussion of value or meaning. There would have to be some criteria by which we can determine what's harmful or what's helpful. And if we're required to do that, that implies some kind of system of morality, some sorts of value judgments, a capability to make value judgments, which implies a system, at least of some bare bones system of morality, some sort of worldview where we can judge, well, this is beneficial, this isn't. So they don't want to get into that game. They don't want to go down that slippery slope of having to advance a substantive particular worldview of any kind. And so they just keep it at impact, which is kind of neutral. We can argue about good or bad, but they just want impactful researchers. And to me, that's when I speak of nihilism, and I know perhaps it sounds a little hyperbolic, but I actually mean that literally. I think it is nihilistic. I think that's formally nihilistic because it intentionally brackets questions of value.
A while back, I watched a podcast or a video stream, actually, like this one, exactly like the same format, split screen conversation the whole time. And it was between Daniel Kaufman, and I'm not sure who the other guy was, but Daniel Kaufman is a philosophy professor who works for the Meaning of Life TV, which is like adjacent to Blogging Heads. You heard of Blogging Heads? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Anyhow, and they were arguing about the push to measure the effectiveness or the utility of the humanities in general. And specifically, one of them was saying that it's unfortunately the case that they've found that those students who have taken, say, philosophy courses tend to be no better when tested when it comes to critical thinking after the courses, especially a year or two after, than they were before. There's no.
I thought philosophy students did pretty well on that kind of stuff. But,
well,
maybe not.
That's what this guy said. This is the empirical. I would think that would be.
Well, wait, it was on the internet, right?
Yeah. So it must be true.
Okay. No, but yeah, it could be. I mean, I've heard. Yeah.
Well,
maybe it is. Maybe it isn't.
Maybe these people. Well, I mean, they did know better than they did before the course. Maybe these people are already good at critical thinking, right? I don't know. But what was interesting?
There is a self-selection. People are going to take philosophy courses as electives, or going to be certain types of people.
Yeah, but the point was that, I mean, Kaufman conceded this was the case, and argued that it didn't matter. That the point of teaching philosophy was not to impart a skill set to the students, but to give them to entry into a kind of life, a worldview, maybe. And he also went on to say that the whole focus
I'm with him so far. I mean, that sounds all right to me.
Yeah, and then he went on to say that the whole focus on making the university system democratic and more accessible ran counter to the philosophical project into the humanities. That, in fact, philosophy wasn't for everyone, that it was only a certain kind of person The kind of person that works at the gas station doesn't need philosophy and probably won't be benefiting from
Oh
it.
well,
I mean,
then he's veering into territory that I'm not going to follow.
right. I know. I'm not saying that
Yeah.
you would endorse this.
Yeah.
Um,
In fact, I would just interject real quickly that I think those two, that kind of inclusive exclusivity, those things aren't mutually exclusive. You know, for one thing, certainly philosophy is not everybody's cup of tea. Why should it be? But presumably, you need a pretty inclusive system that maximally that maximum numbers of people could try it out and then figure that out for themselves. You know, find it out. So I think it's pretty crazy and the very bad kind of exclusivity to somehow try to a priori decide who is going to be good at philosophy or who isn't. I mean, if you want to go that route, we could start with I think it was Duns Scotus, among medieval scholastics, who was very adamant that philosophy shouldn't be studied by anyone under 35. You know,
I kind of agree with that.
I've certainly had darker moments where I've agreed with that, although I tend to up the age to just a year younger than whatever I am at the moment.
You know, yeah, that's right. Yeah, no one under the age of 40, I think. Because I'm 41. No. Okay, but here's the thing about that was I think even this guy would say, oh no, it's not that the people who are working class can't be philosophers. It's just that if your aim in life is not to pursue the realm of to be in the academy or to pursue a certain kind of career, then there's no necessary need for these courses, and you shouldn't expect everyone to get something out of them. So like they were really discussing this in the context of arguing over whether or not the humanities and certain kinds of philosophical writers, like say Plato, should be part of a core curriculum, and if there is any purpose in teaching, you know, working class kids or just, you know, kids that are going to end up in business school or in the sciences, these things, because they don't necessarily walk away with any that doesn't have an impact, is, you know, the point. And he said, well, the point isn't to have an impact on everyone. The point is to select out the people who it really works for. You know,
yeah, but well, even just on basic elite theory of democracy, like Jeffersonian democracy, you still have to, you know, Jefferson said this very, very memorable, notorious phrase. He said about Thomas Jefferson, a very elite individual, obviously slaveholder, all of that, but a great defender of public education, universal public education from the youngest ages through higher education.
Right.
And but Jefferson's sort of troubling way of putting it was that we need to, quote, rake from the rubbish annually, you know, to find the good people. So I don't know. I feel like I'd want to hear a little more about where that view you're describing actually comes from, because there's a kind of inclusion that's quite elitist, a kind of meritocratic view, right? Which says that in order to find the real diamonds in the rough, you actually have to be maximally inclusive, because there's a lot of posh idiots, right? Who don't deserve things. And we now, one of the things I actually really like about Trump, yes, I went there, Trump.
Yeah.
One of the things I wouldn't say I like about Trump, but I like about the Trump situation is that it kind of is a really nice blowing the doors off of the lie of meritocracy.
Yeah.
I think various ways. And I actually feel, because I spent a lot of time among elite types in higher education and in terms of socioeconomic groups and so on. And I've come to believe pretty strongly that one of the things that about Trump that provokes such a visceral reaction in places like where you live and where I live, among others, and on elite college campuses and so on and so forth, is that he represents a grave insult to their images of themselves as atop a hierarchy due to their own merit. When we see this buffoon atop the hierarchy,
right,
and it kind of gives the lie to that meritocratic self-understanding. So I'm not sure where we got here, but I was talking about Jeffersonian democracy, Jefferson to Trump, right? I was talking about Jeffersonian democracy and this raking from the rug. But I would think that would, even that view of democracy would sort of militate against any simplistic elitist notion of the humanities, because presumably to find these people who can benefit from the humanities and who can extend them, who can be impactful armed with them in some respect, you'd have to cast the widest net possible. And so one would defend probably core curricula and so on and so forth, because you never know who you're going to get.
Yeah, one of the things about the Marxist point of view is that it goes beyond this meritocratic perspective, and the aim of it is to erase or overcome or transcend the divisions in labor. In other words, the role of education would be to empower and the working class or everyday people, but not only to empower them, but to empower them to change the form of education, to educate the educators, to
Right.
create a kind of revolutionary, progressive approach to education, so that things are actually learned and then pushed forward.
Right, but as usual with Marxism, that's far more trenchant as critique than it is as a vision of what to do positively. But there certainly is some very strong sense in Marxism. One of the major themes of my last book, this sort of structuralist point, that there's a quote, what Marxist theorists of education call a correspondence theory, right, between society and the structure of education, where the structure of education follows along with the economic system that you have. So you have feudalism, you have an education system characteristic of that system of production, you have capitalism, you have an education system that's characteristic of that form of production. And if shifting to communism, one had and one would have presumably an education system consistent with that form of production.
Right.
And so those school systems are always hitched to the system of production. So post-revolution, let's say in the Marxist sort of
post-revolution.
Post-revolution, you presumably have some post-revolution education forms that are usually rather unspecified.
Yeah.
But there are some goes. There are some stabs taken, but it remains to be seen whether those alternative visions that have been articulated are consistent with a change in economic production. So one example, just a quick example, would be probably one of the most, if we're talking about structure of education and pedagogy and classroom techniques and so on, one of the most interesting radical places I have ever been to is Summerhill. You've maybe heard of Summerhill.
I have.
And
was that mentioned in My Dinner with Andre?
Oh gosh, it's been a while since I've seen that. Maybe it was.
All these media references, all these things I've watched.
Yeah. Well, no, I should know those. Those.
Is it where is Summerhill?
It's in. I believe it's in Essex. It's a couple hours outside of London to the east. Mm-hmm. It's in East Anglia somewhere, I think. But anyway, it's kind of in a small town, and but it's been around since the 50s. And oh God, I'm spacing on the psychologist who set it up. Anyway, his granddaughter's in charge of it. Zoe, her name is. But anyway, Summerhill is based on it's sort of radical libertarianism, almost anarchist libertarian sort of framework. And their motto is that we raise free range children, essentially. And so they have radical democratic governance within the school. So more radical than most people would be prepared to consider to be responsible. So, for example, when we were visiting, they have this democratic meeting that occurs, it's like weekly or whenever there's a need. I forget how often they do it, but their sort of almost governing group is this democratic meeting of all the participants in the school, including children and including small children. So teachers, the head of the school, and the children all get the same vote in deciding, issues, and there are literally no rule. The only rule that I think they stuck to, and very famously, one thing that got them in trouble with the regulators in England was the fact that classes are optional themselves. Lessons are optional, so
Mhm.
students might show up, they might not. They might not show up. The only rule that I saw at the time we visited, and this was like maybe 10 years ago, was that if students left the campus, they had to put they had these key things, like just sort of like keychain type things that they put on a board so people would know they were out.
Mhm.
That's what they had to do. And maybe they have some more high tech way of doing that now. And they incorporated that just for some basic
What was the
safety.
class composition of this school?
Well, see, that's kind of why I brought up the point, because here we have just about the most radical pedagogical experiment, famously so, that's inspired lots of others. And by the way, I thought it was very, very charming. I mean, when we arrived there with a bunch of American college students who, at first, everyone was sort of like, what is this place? This place is terrible. It's kind of run down. It's in this big mansion that's sort of run down. And the campus is kind of rough around the edges, kind of scruffy. And everyone was, oh, this makes no sense. This never works. Optional lessons. It's all 100 reasons you can think about it. But I tell you, to a person, by the time we left there, everyone was very, very charmed by the place.
Yeah.
And to the point where I was feeling injustice of the world that my own kids weren't able to go to a school like that, you know. But anyway, by way of answering your question, this is why I brought up this example, because here we have just about the most radical pedagogical setting that I think exists, short of some kind of really strange cult somewhere. But yet it's an extremely elite clientele. The students, there were a small number of students. I don't remember, I don't think there were more than 50 students there, but tuition was really high. As I recall, it was at least tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. So it was like going to an expensive university, you know. So there's like $25,000, and that was a while back. So it was very expensive. They had an international cohort of students, and because of the entry cost, and maybe they had a few scholarships or something like that, like a private school does, you know. But it was a pretty elite clientele, was my sense.
Yeah.
So there's an example of where, contrary to many people in my field, and I teach in a school of education among other areas in the university, I'm not as big on pedagogy as a solution as some of the more radical pedagogues are.
Well,
yeah, because I think it's oversold as liberatory. Because I think you can have different types of pedagogy can go with different types of politics.
Yeah, certainly the Summerhill approach could be, you know, the approach of fascists, if you want.
Well, yeah,
you know?
Absolutely, and conversely, consider there's an interesting essay by Hannah Arendt, whose politics, I guess, are kind of ambiguous, but she has this interesting essay where she criticizes progressive education, the progressive education as she understood it at her day. She's thinking about people like John Dewey and so on. And where essentially she means child-centered, where you kind of go by the interests of the child and so on and so forth. And she actually defends old school European authoritarian top-down pedagogy.
Yeah.
In the service of revolution, specifically. Right. You know, she says that what happens when you have the teacher who's kind of the cool guru, that tends to, in her view, that tends to make the students kind of more dependent on the teacher. Whereas you have the old school authoritarian pedagogy, the students unite in lateral bonds, kind of horizontal bonds of solidarity against the teacher and the administrator, and it actually, to her, creates more of a revolutionary mentality.
Yeah. Zizek had a similar observation about fathers. He said he prefers the old school authoritarian father rather than the new age sensitive father,
Yeah,
because the old school authoritarian father, let's say you have to go to your grandparents for the weekend to visit, uh, the old school authoritarian father says, I don't care what you say or how you feel about it. Your grandmother loves you and you have to go see her. The end.
right.
And the new age parent says, well, you don't have to go if you don't want to. So the
Yeah,
new age parent
it's
is
all
really
about your
saying you do have
choice.
to go
Right.
and you have to want to,
Right. It's
right?
it's more it's more deeply, it reaches more deeply into your psyche. It's
Right.
That's why I always joke, raising the kids. It's like, well, no, we don't use coercive methods like corporal punishment. We prefer psychological manipulation.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Because we're good people.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's very tricky. You can't really escape it, the authority thing when you're a parent, even if you're like, like I tend to be sort of poke fun at myself a lot, but, you know, ultimately I'm in charge, ultimately, not only am I in charge, but, at a certain level, I'm in charge of their psyche. And I guess I need to back
Right.
off and just be more strict.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is that school. Now, obviously, these things can be taken too far. You
Right.
become a great Santini or something, but I'm not sure how progressive that ends up being. But at the very least, it's a very low bar. I think that at least I'm trying to advance, and maybe you're agreeing with me here. It's a very low bar for the argument we're trying to make, is that there's no the relationship between pedagogy and perhaps parenting techniques and so on, and politics, and what's liberatory politics, what's oppressive. It's not clear. It's
Yeah, I
not.
agree. So, but back to the impact and the university system as you know it. Um,
Yeah.
the
So
one
they
thing
don't want
that's
to tell you what's good or bad. You don't have to provide what's good or bad as long as you have impact. It's like, yeah, I created Zyklon B and it killed millions of people. That's a lot of impact.
yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So the other thing though that's interesting is that it shifts away the focus from education to activism in the community. It's no longer
You mean the
about
university criteria?
yeah, like
No,
when you're
because
being judged,
there's
you're being judged not so much on the I mean, obviously you're probably also being judged based on the results you get with your students, right? And what
yeah, well,
happens with your students, but it
yeah.
also is about it's looking out of the university to judge the university's success.
Well, to an extent. I mean, it depends where you are. So, one thing that's pretty universal, certainly in American higher education, is that faculty are evaluated across three criteria: teaching, research, and service. So they're kind of covering all the bases. And teaching is fairly obvious. It's the university teaching that you're doing with your students, and that's usually a consumer market research approach these days, where students rate you,
Hmm.
or you can go on Rate My Professors and go see how I'm doing. That
Yeah.
kind of, so you get rated along in that way. And there are a few other things that maybe go into that. It depends where you are and how seriously they take that stuff. But then there's the research, which is the books and articles and things you write. Um, and or research could be maybe a few other things. If you're an artist, it could be your productions, or if you're a musician, it could be your performances, that kind of stuff. But usually it's journal articles and books and stuff like that, depending on the field you're in. And how those are taken seriously. Like some fields, like psychology, they don't care about books; those are considered to be un rigorous, and so it's just your journal articles.
Hmm.
In high level journals, which Blind Review being the coin of the realm, all that stuff. But then there's service, which usually means just committee work within the university, but it also very often means service, like you're the treasurer of the some national scholarly organization. You get service sort of brownie points for that. But it can also mean stuff you do in the community. But it's not really mandated at most places that service take any particular form. It's just that you have to be doing some of it in some shape or form, but it can be very, very insular. And one thing to say about higher ed, it's pretty heterogeneous. And I think a lot of discussion about higher education, especially when we're talking about politicized issues in higher education, like campus ideological disputes and so on, is there's a huge overemphasis on elite campuses.
Mhm.
You know, elite campuses where the life for faculty on elite campuses, and I mean, say, everything from flagship public universities up to expensive private schools, Ivy League schools, those kinds of places. Life at a place like that for a faculty person has almost nothing to do with life for a faculty person who teaches at a community college.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times some of the things going on that are artifacts of insane levels of privilege at the higher end, the whole system gets tarred with some of the things going on at that system. So, for example, at an elite university, faculty might just teach 1 or 2 courses. In fact, that would be the norm, 1 or 2 courses a semester. Whereas at a lower level university, they're going to teach 4 or even 5 courses
Right.
a semester. That's a completely different life if you're teaching 4 or 5 classes than if you're teaching 1 or 2.
Right.
And so the expectations are adjusted to an extent to where you are. So at the most prestigious places, they really just care about research. I mean, lip service is given to teaching and service, and those are important, but really everyone kind of knows that what it comes down to is your research production.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what allegedly justifies your low teaching load and so on and so forth. Whereas at a smaller state university where you're teaching 4 faculty, you're teaching, say, 4 courses, or certainly a community college, they often will really take teaching seriously. And you can rise or fall or get promoted or not promoted, tenure, not tenure, on the basis of your teaching. So I know that's a bit of a long digression, but it's hard to generalize too much. And I actually think there's a bit too much generalizing, because these kinds of almost luxurious disputes at the elite universities, I think, get undue prominence when we discuss the system as a whole.
So when you talk about these luxurious disputes, can you give me an example of one?
Well, I mean, some of the ideological fights on campus with policing internal diversity, sometimes sort of some of the things that tend to go viral. That the
Like the Halloween costume thing?
Yeah, the Halloween thing at Yale would be a good example of that in their
Right.
residence halls.
And that's a result of
anytime you want examples, just flip on Tucker Carlson or something.
Okay.
You'll get examples every night.
And how is that exactly the result of a research-oriented university and a privileged professor class? Wouldn't it be, I guess, also the result of a privileged student body? I mean,
well, I mean the two. I mean the two as of a piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that university professors at like at Harvard or Yale or Princeton or University of Chicago might feel more pressure than your average community college professor or just state school professor to be an enjoyable product for their students? To be
no, I think they feel. I don't know. I mean, that's so dependent on individual psyches, how much pressure people feel. But I think that there's a lot of publisher parish pressure at the high end. That's what it is. High levels of stress, I think, very high levels of stress. But the stress is oriented around research.
Right.
Certainly at the lower, and I say lower just in terms of lower amounts of research required. University, not lower in some pejorative sense.
But let's be honest, it's lower in terms of influence
they don't have
too.
stress about research as much.
I mean, I remember Moich Pistone in a lecture said that the American university system is extremely hierarchical, and that what matters in American education really only happens in a few schools. That these schools are the ones that matter, and that every other university doesn't matter. He wasn't saying it with love in his heart or saying this is how it should be, but just how it was.
I guess it means, what does he mean by? I guess I mean, in a sense,
matter in so much as like it will affect, let's say, will be taken seriously in terms of the scholarship that's produced, where the scholarship comes from, where the funding goes to is part of it. So like if you want to find top-notch Hegel research, you're going to look to a few elite schools. You're not going to look to every university because the research isn't coming out of every university. Also, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's as true as it once was, honestly, because I think the humanities are so beleaguered and small, and like say philosophy, which is the area that I know the best. I wouldn't say that that's true in philosophy. I think it's certainly if I see someone in philosophy at a certain number of institutions, I certainly share some of that hierarchical prejudice. I say, oh well, they must be good, if they're. But I think the humanities jobs are so scarce in philosophy that I think anyone with a full-time job anywhere in the system is going to be pretty damn good. And have at least something going for them. Obviously, there are exceptions out there, but I'm always amazed by people in philosophy who I see writing, especially those kind of on the edges who are exploring ideas that are somewhat out of the mainstream. Excellent scholars and researchers who are literally at community colleges or schools that I personally have not even heard of until I see their sort of byline. And I've heard of a lot of schools, so you have to work pretty hard to come up with a school I haven't heard of. And so I'd say that might be true in some fields, but I feel like it's not true in the humanities at this point.
Okay. So just as an aside, and then I'm going to get back to the meat of this, but I just want you to know that on Rate My Professors, you have a 4.5, which is good.
Pretty good.
Yeah,
I'm pretty good.
You're lecture heavy. You're respected. You're a tough grader. If you skip class, you won't pass. That's
right. And I like that one. That's a good one because I figure, and I don't have an attendance policy either for my classes. So I figure if the people have made it for large classes, at least like large lecture classes. Yeah. So I figure if you can do well without coming, then what am I doing? What value am I adding? I have a different view in seminars, small groups of students, because I feel like participating in discussion with others is part of the experience.
Right.
So I actually do have attendance expectations in seminars, but not for the big. But anyway, yeah. So thank you. You've outed me. Rate My Professor. That's It's kind of daunting in a way because I meet someone and they know my name. They can immediately find out so much stuff about me online. It's really,
4.5 is a high quality overall, but only 46% of your students would take a class from you again.
Well,
that's because they're lazy.
They are lazy.
You're a tough grader.
I'm a tough enough grader. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't. Yeah, that's all right. I would. You don't want to be too well liked.
No. High quality, but not.
I would rather be. Do you want to be loved or feared? That's the question. Right?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very difficult. Yeah, both.
I want both.
I want both simultaneously.
Yeah,
I want you to love being afraid of me.
Absolutely.
So, all right, but back to see now that one comment at the start on the Patreon said, "Oh, Black or superficial." I think maybe the problem is not you, but me. Let me see if we can go into this impact idea and the nihilism, because if you're doing research, let's say it's a research-heavy school, and the research is going to be judged, I guess, in terms of quantity and quality of publication.
Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be both, but oftentimes it's hard to judge quality. But there are quality measures that are kind of supposed to be.
Well, the quality of the publication is prestige, right?
Yeah, like blind review at top journals, and it just depends where you are. A lot of places there's a fair degree of consensus what the top journals are and so on, and there's kind of A-level journals, B-level, C-level, and depending on the institution where you are, you'd want to be in the higher level ones, or at least have a good proportion of your research articles in those.
Right, and those top journals are judged as being top journals based on their reputation over time. In other words, if they've been around for a long time and have garnered a lot of
their editorial boards, there's kind of just a consensus in the field as to what's a top journal. Their acceptance rate is low, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So that's,
they're cited a lot. That these are studied. They publish impact levels of journals by calculating all the data. It's a lot of data. What journals are cited the most,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. These things are all known, and so they can establish hierarchies of journals based on these metrics.
So all of this seems nihilistic to you, and I guess it seems nihilistic to me, but as a little bit as well. But uh, how would you introduce a worldview and an ethics into education? Um, what kinds of things? I guess I should really ask this: what kinds of things would we be looking for so that a worldview and an ethics could be possible in education?
Um, okay, well, yeah, well, I'm not sure. I think, well, first of all, the structure of the university predates capitalism and so
Right.
on. So let's get that clear. And these universities were animated and essentially set up initially under a non a worldview of Christendom,
Right,
essentially.
but was tracking the citations as a means to judge the value of the work something that happened in medieval universities?
No, no, nobody cared about that.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that wasn't really part of
The
that
thing
wasn't
that
really part
caught
of what was going on.
the things you're
Um,
you're critiquing as nihilistic seem to me to be modern.
well, that's right. And
Yeah.
well, yeah, what I'm creating is that I think that there is an well, there are different types of universities. We have private universities, we have public universities, and especially in the public universities, but increasingly in the large private universities as well, are pretty much indistinguishable in many ways from the larger public universities. Um, there has been an understandable post World War II with GI Bill and so on, this massive entrance and spirit of inclusion into those universities, and a massive explosion in higher education for the last few generations. And so that drive toward inclusion is understandable, laudable, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the ethos and of non-exclusion, which is also tied up with an economic base of student loans and so on. There are various things that universities need to do to be eligible for student loans, to count as nonprofits. I mean, to count as not taxable in terms of the tax codes and so on. There are certain requirements that they have to fulfill, and they've adopted an extremely inclusive sort of framework, which is neutralist to a high degree, certainly on matters such as religion and things like that, as opposed to, say, a very religious private school at the K-12 level, or even a smaller religious college, which can often maintain a different sort of stance. And this while laudable, this desire to take all comers and to and adhering to a norm of non-discrimination and so on, has obviated or made very, very difficult any discussion of substantive animating ideals that might govern the university as a whole. It
Mhm.
doesn't really stand for much beyond itself at this point. It's become corporatized, I suppose you could say, in a word.
What would you say that Summerhill has that same
Well, I
quality?
think Summerhill has a worldview. I think that's
Mhm.
fairly well thought out. I mean, it's based on at least psychological principles that are very deeply believed in by those who work in the school and run the school, having to do with human liberation and an ideal of character. And they have a what I call in the book, harkening back to classical times, a paideia, which is a cultural ideal. So that's one way to be non-nihilistic. Say paideia comes from the ancient Greeks, and the idea of a paideia is a cultural, like I said, a cultural ideal that is educating toward an ideal. There's some sort of picture. It could be somewhat implicit, but a lot of times it's quite explicit of what a flourishing human life is, or what a proper human being is, what the type of ideal person. It's kind of sometimes philosophers call this a perfectionism. There's a vision of what kind of human being we're seeking to mold and create an education. And that's a paideia, where you have some kind of cultural ideal. And I think that's what's more or less lacking in the sort of big corporate style universities that we have now. Even the private nominally, many of the private nominally religious ones are kind of lacking this at this point. But I think somewhere like Summerhill definitely has that kind of animating ideal, and they're quite explicit about their graduates. So, for example, a lot of private schools, and Summerhill, by economic standards, would count as a very elite private school, with the tuition levels and so on. And a lot of times you go to those schools, and I went to a school like that myself. In their pamphlets and their literature, their websites, they'll trumpet the amazing graduates they've had and what they're much money that, well, maybe they don't crudely say how much money they make, but they'll talk about how prestigious their graduates, the prestigious things they've done in business and government and
Right.
arts and all that. They'll sort of trumpet their success, but Summerhill very steadfastly refuses to do any of that, and they will talk as much about a graduate who became a plumber and talk as much about that person as one of their cherished, valued alums as
Right.
someone who is a member of parliament,
Right.
and they're actually pretty rigorous, and they have a lot of integrity about that. And I think there's something, you can debate Summerhill in particular, but I think there's something laudable about having a particular vision like that, which so there's a clear idea, a more or less clear idea of, oh, here's how we've succeeded or failed. This is the kind of human being that we think is worthwhile to expend all these educational efforts to create.
And just exactly what kind of human being is it that they can find in someone who goes on to become a plumber rather than an MP?
Well,
What is it that they're looking for in terms of character?
I think they're just looking at the sort of common sense things that most of us would look for. They're looking for someone who's a responsible member of society, who's kind, caring, who's had a beneficial impact on the world in terms of helping other people live better lives, someone who's made the world a better place, that sort of thing. So consequentialist criteria, someone who's kind, compassionate, has shown that in many ways, that kind of stuff. So nothing off the wall or strange, just the kind of thing that you if you saw in a family member or neighbor, you would recognize as, oh, that's a very good person, someone I would like to aspire to be like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you still get a newspaper delivered?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So do we. This is a mark of being older now,
Yeah.
for sure. But and I sometimes will read the obituaries. In fact, my wife reads the obituaries every morning. She finds those to be more uplifting than reading the news somehow.
Well, if I remember, she's also a Titanic enthusiast, so maybe there's some.
Yes, she is. That's right. She was anyway, years and years ago. So read the obituaries. And I'll read the obituaries, and I judge people in the obituaries based on what their families have decided is important to tell you about them.
Right.
Like if their families say generic things, that may be better than some of the times when they say very specific things like, Susie loved ice cream, or
right.
or Susie couldn't get enough of the outdoors, loved to go out in nature, that kind of thing.
Right. Some of them are depressing, where it's like, Susie liked to go out to dinner. It's like, wow.
Right. Well, that's what we remember, because the people are left.
For me to judge anyone, but that just seems a little sad,
Yeah, just love fine foods and Denny's.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, some of them are depressing. But then there are the other ones which seem kind of stodgy, like accomplished this, was a loving father to these kids, and was in this marriage, and.
It's like a posthumous job resume or something.
Yeah, right. I like those better somehow. These are what this person's done. This is their accomplishments. This is what they aimed at in life, rather than here are the little things they enjoyed.
I don't
do you-
know. That's a hard one. I almost like the little things they enjoyed, except I want a nice quirky list of things they enjoyed at least.
right. If they have you want the hipster list. They like the Velvet Underground, and couldn't get enough of the films of Stanley Kubrick or something like that.
Yeah, I actually talk about something like that in the book, and you got in trouble. We've both been canceled, I think, 14 times now. I've counted. So there's my 15th attempt at getting
Really,
canceled.
you got during this conversation or last conversation?
No, over the last few, you've been I think the total number of cancellations is about 14. So I want to go for 15. More Woody Allen, right?
Oh,
yeah. That's you brought up before I went out. But there's a scene where he's sort of listing the things in life that are valuable, and they're all just little things. A
right.
certain movement in a symphony, the chicken
At a certain restaurant.
at a certain restaurant, this, that, these small things that make. So I'm kind of a parson of the small things too, that add up. And I actually think that's an important component of a worldview. And I try to take pains to explain this in the book, that I think sometimes when you hear the worldview, or I don't know, zeitgeist or whatever equivalent, there's a tendency to look only upward, to think of it as just this sort of highfalutin expression of the highest purposes and ideals, and like paideia, the cultural ideals and so on. I think that's a big part of it, but I think that's not all of it. If what one is articulating is limited to that, I think it's more just an intellectual parlor game. I think you also a bona fide worldview actually has to animate people's lives as they live it. It has to be productive of these small pleasures and small aesthetic moments. It has to provide a framework in which those things can flourish, and there's provide a rich ground for those things. It has to be, so there's a heterogeneity that has to exist. It has to be capable of gathering people together in terms of the life cycle: birth, death, marriage, rituals of various sorts. It has to have, and here's one hallmark I think I can advance on this show. Is this a show? Can I call it a show?
Yeah, it's a show.
Yeah. I will say that here's one of a telling hallmark in my conception of a bona fide worldview is that it needs to have a cookbook associated with it. If there's no cookbook, don't trust it. So, for example,
there goes Marxism.
I know. Well, it's a problem. Okay?
Anarchism has a cookbook.
Well, yes, of the sort. So for example, and now this is cancellation number 16.
Okay.
Now, and I don't mean that these worldviews are good or bad. They're all types. There are bad ones, good ones, and so on. So one that I talk about, there's a species of worldviews that are sort of infused with aestheticism as a guiding principle. We mentioned briefly Fluxus and Situationists and that kind of stuff, but to me, one of the most interesting ones is a kind of almost proto-fascist one, which is the Futurists, Italian, and they're sort of a communist counterpart of the Russian futurist, constructivists, and so on. But the Italian futurists, like Marinetti and a lot of manifestos. It was sort of the age of manifesto writing. But there's a futurist cookbook. You could go on Amazon and get the futurist cookbook, and they have all kinds of insane recipes that you're supposed to serve at gatherings. Dishes that have ball bearings in them, and just nothing you would ever want to eat. It's insane. And so I think it was Marinetti himself that had this. I just love these stories about him, and he had this quixotic campaign in Italy. All right, we're talking, I believe, 20s. I could be wrong. It could be more the teens. 20s, but to have pasta banned in Italy, on the grounds it made people lazy and slow and fat, and we need to eat ball bearings and not pasta, and stuff like that. But now it's crazy, and a lot of them became fascists, though I think they're too weird for the actual fascists. And so they end up just being sort of themselves only. But there's something even. I certainly am not going to embrace their amoralism and so on. There's a lot of cruelty in futurism,
Right.
and but there's something I like about their chutzpah. You know, the this attempt to say something about regular areas of life too, to not just leave it at the intellectual manifesto level, but to offer something more comprehensive. And I like the ambitiousness of it. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, well, I think a Marxist
Ambition isn't good or bad. Don't get me wrong.
right. No, I know.
Nazis
I
were
think a
ambitious
Marxist
too.
cook. I'm just thinking about a Marxist
Yeah.
cookbook, and I think a Marxist cookbook would say, irrespective of the actual ingredients, what's important is the form of the social relation in the kitchen. You know.
That's right. And the
So
production, and then we could have a liberal cookbook, which would be fair trade ingredients and,
right,
you know, organic and all that kind of stuff, and
right.
you know, whole food. Well, there used to be. Do you remember when
The Marxists would say, you know, the waiters and waitresses and the you know the underlings need to seize the means of the soup, you know, soup production or something like, you
right,
know,
exactly.
and then whatever they want to make, no blueprints for the future, no
Exactly.
recipes for our future revolutionary kitchen.
But you know, if we're going to talk about cookies, there's a futurist cookbook which I encourage everyone to look up, and I would give like a cash prize to anyone who makes the recipes any of the recipes and serves them at a party or something.
I'll see if I can get a hold of a PDF of it, and
yeah, I think there is a free PDF out there that you can get.
Yeah, and then I'll make one of the recipes and be eating it when we do this again.
Absolutely. Well, just have medics standing by,
you
know, while you're eating it, some of that stuff. But do you remember, if we're talking about cooks, do you remember an example though would be, I think maybe, do you remember when the Moosewood cookbook was popular?
No.
The sort of vegetarian, they're actually quite, I think, important in the
farm. We have a farm. Remember
movement.
KMO went to the farm?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they put out a cookbook.
Okay.
Vegan cookbook. And
okay. Well, yeah, that's an example. Or Moosewood is an actual restaurant in Ithaca. It's Ithaca, New York. It's very popular, and that was kind of a Bible for in the 1980s for vegetarians and so on, when that seemed kind of cool and new, you know, being vegetarians and the reason I bring up that example is I think that's an example of a cookbook that is kind of tied into at least a nascent sort of sensibility. That's beyond just the cookbook. It's kind of a sensibility, a nascent worldview. But just one example. So when I'm looking at worldviews, I don't want just these high level theological debates or philosophical debates. I want something that's capable of ordering regular life and providing a context within which meaning is possible for the events of one's life.
Well, I think actually we talked now for 57 minutes, and I think that's a great place to end. And we can pick up on cookbooks and ways of life in our next conversation. And then after that, we'll put them all together and release a video for everybody.
Okay, that sounds good. I feel like I didn't quite answer your question about higher education, but hopefully that's enough of a window in. The notion that impact of faculty research, that we've lost a vocabulary for deciding whether or not that impact is beneficial or harmful, because that implies making value judgments of a type that that everyone's afraid to make at this point.
It sounds to me like what you think is that the students, when they're done with the university life, should know what, you know, like for instance, a graduate from Portland State University, where I went, eats. What kinds of meals are appropriate for a PSU grad? They should be indoctrinated with a worldview.
Well, I mean, you don't have to be a Foucaultian to feel that there's some wisdom maybe in looking from the ground up at the sort of micro practices instead of going. And certainly the last place you want to look, and I spend a fair amount of time lampooning this in the chapter on higher education, the book, of the sort of boilerplate marketing language that universities use to sort of sell themselves.
The thing is, now there are appropriate meals for the people who are university educated, but no one wants to accept or, you know, admit to them. Like I think going to a farmer's market in Portland
Right.
would be an appropriate thing for someone who's university educated to do.
Right.
Or maybe being a connoisseur of the better kinds of mass-produced foods, or like going to Target rather than Walmart would be an important decision for a university educated
Right. Or if
person.
you're super woke, Costco. But
Right. Okay. Right.
yeah.
Right. All right. Well, we'll talk again next week. I'm going to end the broadcast here.
Okay.
And yeah, that went